and Gregory Nobles. So I am going to pass it over to Krista, who has a wonderful presentation for you all. Whenever you're ready.
Oh, Shauna, could you start it back up again? And I was unmuted, and thank you. Well, thank you. I first want to thank the staff at the Turchin Center for the Visual Arts who invited me to exhibit in this beautiful space, and to those of you who made this possible: Denise, Shauna, Christy, Lynn, Craig, Aaron, and so many others. You did a beautiful job with the installation. I also want to thank the Turchin staff for inviting their colleagues from the broader community and the university campus, such as the Greater New River Conservancy, the Museum of the Cherokee Indian, where I visited on my field trip and field work and learned so much and came away with an armful of books. The resources you have in that your institutions are just so deep and valuable, especially your archives. I also want to thank the Department of Appalachian Studies and the Office of Sustainability for being part of this conversation as well. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And then I also want to thank Mary Ann Redding for collaborating with me on this first and definitely not last eco conversation. We've been doing this kind of place-based work for decades. And our book, Through the Lens, Creating Santa Fe, we took a deep dive into the photographic history of Santa Fe, and we plan to elaborate on that later on. And also thank you, Gregory Nobles, for writing the bibliography about this iconic American woodsman. Your scholarship is woven throughout the 7 episodes in my book. And I look forward to talking with you about the man, the American landscape before the Civil War, and why all of this is relevant today. And finally, I want to thank those who registered for this 90-minute lunch and learn for your openness and curiosity for just showing up, especially on an early Monday morning. It seems that whenever the topics of John James Audubon, birds, and history are mentioned, then people gather and listen, they converse and question, and hopefully continue to show up and act on what they have learned. This is why I'm here today, and I'm honored to be with you. For the next few minutes, I'm going to attempt to give you a sneak peek into my creative process. I'll begin with my personal journey of the how and why details that never made it into the book, the outtake, if you will. Then I will begin to speak about the powers of mentorship and how they are part of my work process. And finally, I'll be able to provide some details about the final structure of the book of A Country No More, Rediscovering the Landscapes of John James Audubon. So as you settle in your chair, I wanted to invite you into my studio and see where I have been living for over 30 years in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And our home and studio rests on the original territory of the Pueblo Nations, and more specifically, the homelands of the Tewa people. My roots did not begin in New Mexico. The family photograph you see on the screen is mine. I'm the teenager with her belly showing, the second person to the right. The photo was taken around 1970 by my grandmother. 7 of our lined up, and we're in my grandparents' home in Guatemala City, which is in Central America. For 3 generations, my German relatives grew coffee in the Alta Verapaz highlands of Guatemala, a mountainous region that is located deep inside the ancestral homelands of the Mayan nations. My mom is the second person on the left. She's the only one looking directly into the camera. My dad is standing next to her, and he always has a pen in his front pocket. This is how I always knew him. He would always say to me and my 3 sisters, Write down all of your impressions. Then you can imagine and create the world that you want to live. Now that I'm 64, I often think of and appreciate his wisdom in life. After all, both of his parents immigrated to the United States in 1898. They came through Ellis Island, which is located inside the New York harbor. They were 100% Ashkenazi, and they survived the pogrom, waves of anti-Jewish killing riots that swept through Imperial Russia in the early 1880s. My dad was the youngest of 6 children, and he was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey. My parents met in Montreal, Canada, married in Tennessee, and I was born in Denver, Colorado. What I most remember about my childhood was moving. Before I graduated from high school, I attended 9 different schools in Colorado, Guatemala, California, and Germany. However, what most interests me about this family photo is Meches, the woman wearing the white apron that I'm holding on to. Meches, look how uncomfortable she looks being pulled closer to my side. And yet for me, I know that she was my first foster auntie. Meches was my first introduction to indigenous Mayan culture. For years, she lovingly cared for me and my sisters. Her recipe for handmade tamales, wrapped in banana leaves that are stuffed with masa, achote, chicken, prunes, and olives, remains a staple diet for me and my family today. If my memory is correct, not long after this family photograph was made, I, like any healthy teenager, began to question authority in general, and more specifically, the more powerful undercurrent of control that is better known as patriarchy, a culturally based system in which the father or the eldest male in the family is the head of the family, and where all major decisions and outcomes are traced through the masculine lineage. So the first time, 40 years later, we're moving forward now, and the first time I photographed a bird was 35 years after this family photograph was made. I was at the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge, a 3-hour drive south of Santa Fe. Our daughter, Maya Lee, was 10 at the time. She was awestruck by the early dawn flight of sandhill cranes, and I was filming a video about cancer in collaboration with Jack Leffler, a noted author and artist. I began filming birds as symbols for freedom, vulnerability, and passing. It was an especially touching metaphor for me, as I too was recovering from cancer. In my own healing, led me to understand how healthy ecosystems sustain healthy migrations, and how rapid changes in habitat are difficult for all species, including ivory-billed woodpeckers and artists. So I became aware of John James Audubon when I was about 50 because I wanted to photograph migrating birds. And who better would know where they are than John James Audubon? And his vivid journal entries hooked me into his orbit. And I had to read everything about his life and time so that I could understand what this was all about. And what you're seeing right now is his handwritten copy of The Runaway. Again, reading original journals and autobiographies helped me better understand the places that he went, and they intrigued me to want to photograph them. So I wanted to show you how my visual ideas kind of evolved over the course of the project. In keeping with my dad's advice, I kept detailed journals as well as snapshots of field notes. And in my early field work, I saw a lot of eagles. I wasn't seeing birds that I thought, and so these are some of the eagles that came my way as I was in field work, and I took note of this. There were a lot of cars and references to Audubon with cars. And initially, that is how I began kind of taking sketch ideas. Then, of course, then there are the birders, and I started noticing them and what they were doing and how they were part of this picture. The people I met, I photographed and came across, all were interested in Audubon, knew about him, and they were part of my initial field work. Of course, birds were everywhere, even if they were man-made, and I started photographing them, and then you can start to see other urban birds that started to show up. Just kind of taking note of what birds look like within the urban scene. These all never made it into the book, but I thought I would share as a photographer some of the outtake. Another line of inquiry was me getting there and journeying, and I did so in my Eurovan camper, who I call Lucy. And Lucy and I spent a lot of hours, miles and miles together, getting to places over the course of 6 years. Every artist needs a Lucy, and we'll talk more about her and Lucy in the conversation section. But this is where I knew that the work I was doing was not as satisfying. It was not answering the question, where are the birds? And that's when I began to go back to my mentors and to help me find a way of what was important. And this is where I dedicate my book to Dr. Dave Warren, who helped me along these lines so well. He's a historian, diplomat, a Tiwa elder of the Santa Clara Pueblo in northern New Mexico, a mentor and a friend. And Dr. Dave encouraged me to look at history like a Cubist painting, in the sense that while it might appear to be a woman walking down a flight of stairs, you have to study it from many different perspectives in order to understand it. Sometimes it's hard to look at, it's not always pretty, but history matters. And with that kind of structure that Dave always continues to encourage me to follow, I began to focus on trees wherever I went. Audubon is the primary narrator in the book. I'm following his biography, but it's the trees that I found in these areas that I felt most connected to, and hopefully perhaps had some way of hoping that Audubon may have seen them as well. I started focusing in on the oldest trees in the communities that he wrote about, and that is, these are in the book, and it's this subject that interests me the most, and how they are responding to today's climate conditions. Obviously, you're not seeing any birds because it was very hard for me to find them where I was at the time. I focused on, again, the oldest trees that I could. And from trees, I then turned to, this is the oldest tree in St. I've forgotten the name, but St. Well, then we turned to water, and this is the confluence of the Missouri River and the Big Sioux, and it's right outside of Sioux City, Iowa. Water, trees became the focus of my journey, and that mixed with hope. I tried to really focus on the hope side of it, and how time influences all of this, and to respect that time. And that's what my book does, is goes back in time and forward in time and kind of helps us all kind of figure out where we are and what's happened to these landscapes during that time. The banknotes and maps are an integral part of the book. I titled this piece, Economies in Conflict with the Bachman's Warbler. It is the front piece of one of my episodes of Searching for the Bachman Warbler. The second one is Visions of Recovery for the 21st Century, a collage including a map from 1803 that's on the cover of the book, which we'll talk a little bit about and why. And then the final one is I'm using Audubon's watercolors. This is the front piece for In the Land of the Ivory-billed Woodpecker. I titled this piece, The Conflict of New Economies on the Ivory-billed Woodpecker and the Trees That Support Them. Again, we'll have a chance to talk about this. The title of my introduction is Getting Lost is the Beginning of Discovery. And that is a phrase that my dear mentor, Signe Stewart, sent to everyone. And I picked it up, and it really is the essence of my work process, of really respecting the idea of getting lost. And then that eventually moves into discovery of what I was looking for. Scholars have been trying to untangle the facts from the fiction about Audubon's life for nearly 200 years. Even he wasn't completely sure of his own life story. Perhaps as a result, he embellished or fabricated a lot of what he didn't know, presumably to paint a rosier and more aristocratic picture of his origins than the complete truth, which would have presented, which, in other words, he's the archetype of the unreliable narrator. Nevertheless, I do trust his descriptions of the places and the number of the kind of birds and animals that he found and wrote about. I've taken great pains to excerpt only from the journals that we know are his, as opposed to those that were sanitized by his granddaughter, Maria Audubon. For this book, Audubon is the main character. I have taken excerpts from what he wrote that particularly moved me. These excerpts appear unedited in their original form. Not surprisingly, 3 of the episodes are about birds. I weave these excerpts into 7 episodes that illuminate his thinking and mine and provide insight into his character and to some of the key places, events, and people in his life, especially his loyal wife, Lucy Bakewell Audubon. I also include corresponding collages and individual images for each episode, which present along with the text to provide historical context for Audubon's journey and the land he traversed. Studying the period banknotes and maps helped me not only understand the massive changes that occurred in the areas that Audubon and I later traveled through, but they also get to the sense of what those areas were like geographically, culturally, and even commercially when Audubon was living and working there. The book's title, A Country No More, is expressed on the cover image collage, which includes a French-made map from 1803 and a watercolor detail of Audubon's trumpeter swan. It's the opening act for the episodes because it represents the French perspective of the Louisiana Purchase, lands that are defined by the Mississippi River and its western tributaries, the lands that were sold to the new republic. In 1803 is also significant because it was the year that Audubon immigrated from France to the United States. It was also the time when nature was sovereign and very biodiverse. It is when rivers ran wild, old growth forests were managed by indigenous nations, and birds darkened the sky as they migrated to places that kept them healthy. Thank you so much for your interest in my work. I look forward to the conversation. Take it from there, Shauna, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Krista, for that amazing presentation. It's so nice to get a deeper look and to see some of your outtakes. Joining us are Marianne Redding and Gregory Nobles. Marianne Redding has more than 35 years experience working as a curator, archivist, librarian, educator, arts administrator, and writer. She received a BA in English Literature from Ohio University, an MA in Arts Administration from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, an MLS from the University of Illinois, as well as an advanced certificate in museum studies from Arizona State University. Marianne has published with Krista Elric Through the Lens, Creating Santa Fe from the Museum of New Mexico Press in 2009, which accompanied the exhibition of the same name at the Palace of the Governors, New Mexico History Museum. Formerly the curator of the Turchin Center for the Visual Arts at Appalachian State University right here in Boone, North Carolina, curator for the Marion Center of Photographic Arts, and the chair of the photography department at the Santa Fe University of Art and Design. She is currently an independent curator and will be moving back to Boone at the end of July, and we are very excited about that. Gregory Nobles received his AB in History cum laude from Princeton University and his PhD in History from the University of Michigan. He is now Professor of History Emeritus at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he spent 33 years as a faculty member and administrator. During that time, he held 2 Fulbright professorships, Senior Scholar in New Zealand in 1995 and John Adams Chair in American History in the Netherlands in 2002. And residential fellowships at the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, the Princeton University Library, and the Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois. He is the author, co-author, and co-editor of 5 acclaimed books, including Whose American Revolution Was It? Historians Interpret the Founding, with Alfred F. Young, American Frontiers, Cultural Encounters and Continental Conquest, and most recently, John James Audubon, The Nature of the American Woodsman. So we'll go ahead and jump into our Q&A session. And like we said, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and Christy will get those to me. I'd love to start out with Krista. My favorite question to ask artists who work in the photographic medium is why photography? You know, what made you fall in love with the process that you utilize and the ability to capture light?
Well, thank you, Christy. I love answering that question too. I was a shy kid, and when I got my first camera, it was as if I could go places and explore places with intention. I had a friend, a partner with me who gave me the guts to go and document and prove that I had been a certain place. I also really love working in the darkroom. My initial experience was under the dim light of a gang darkroom. So many lively conversations took place, and it has long been a very safe, secure environment for me because I can control it. And it's a place where I really just get very excited about creating work. And so it is that darkroom time that really is at the heart of my love of the media, and then working with film. I had been working with film since the beginnings of my relationship with photography, and that process of having an actual object in my hand that was sensitive to light, that was a mystery at the moment I was making the photograph, where there are no guarantees of what you're going to get, and yet having faith in the process, and then at the time that it takes from making the initial image to then getting back to your darkroom and then processing the film, making the contact sheet, can take months. And it's that extended period of time that that latent image, as it becomes then an image that you can see, begins to grow and have more meaning over the course of a long period of time. And that is what keeps me going with it. Now, of course, the new technology is just, one has to maintain your skills in these areas so that one can engage with the public. And but it's really that slow process of film and darkroom that keeps me excited.
That's wonderful. We have a comment/question from Judy Natal. It says, what beautiful work and book. Could you share how the form of your collages evolved?
Wow. Well, initially, when I started out working with Audubon and trying to find these places, which took a good deal of research, I realized that once I got to these places, they were nothing from what I expected. His vivid journals were such a hook, and yet when I got to these places, they were so changed. And I then began to really get frustrated and realized that the single image was not going to work, that I needed to create and take multiple images of a place and then try to reconstruct them into something that was more dynamic, more beautiful. And when you look at my collages, I am intentionally not making the edges match. I want them to be on the edge of you can recognize that there are multiple images and they are not perfect. And that is so intentional because the landscape that I'm looking at is so changed from the natural ecosystem that Audubon described. So then it became about matching these different materials and making them both uncomfortable but beautiful, and being interested in that uncomfortable dynamic but still engaging enough so that you want to spend time with it.
Thank you. That kind of leads into my next question. This particular project is so multi-dimensional and showcases your own photographs, like you said, along this fragmented Audubon imagery. And through your writings, you've given us a really extensive contextual understanding of the intricacies of this history and sort of how it plays into that larger conversation about conservation, as well as really important questions about who should be leading that conversation. So how did you come to working so interdisciplinarily and really bringing all of these elements together?
Well, I think that that interdisciplinary nature was in my DNA. I kind of shared my own family history and how it is in itself complicated, complex, and it's not an easy picture for me to understand, let alone anyone else. So that's what drew me for all of my career towards a more indigenous perspective so that I could better understand what was going on. Again, Dave Warren's leadership and his mentorship was encouraging me to embrace that interdisciplinary approach, that was the only way to really make sense out of what I was grappling with and trying to find these birds. And so I think that interdisciplinary approach is pretty much in my DNA, and I've learned to celebrate that rather than try to eliminate a lot of other ideas just so that I can fit into some box that is perhaps more acceptable.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned that I find really interesting is how the opera, particularly the Santa Fe opera, influenced how you thought about Audubon, and you even sequenced the exhibition at the Turchin Center through these episodes. Could you expand on this way of thinking about sort of this epic quality of an adventurous life and how you tell that story in words and images?
Well, yeah, I'm going to start with the beginning. As a young teenager, I was often confused about everything around me and who was doing what country I was in, what school I was, why I was there. And my mother gave me some sage advice. She said that whenever you feel confused about the world in front of you, go find a comfortable chair, close your eyes, and then just pretend it's all an opera that you're watching. And I, of course, at the time, didn't know what an opera was. And yet when I watched adults coming and going from an opera, I would see them afterwards giggling and arguing. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I think I'm interested in that concept of seeing the world as if it were a stage. Then it turns out that when we moved to Santa Fe, there's a International Opera House, and it is an open stage opera. It is open to the weather, and it faces north, and it is a beautiful space whereby these epic journeys take place, where there's music and tragedy and power lost and gained and love, and the whole notion of incorporating such a dynamic history that's layered with, again, music and visuals and being live are things that I really began to think about in Audubon's life. And it is such an epic drama that the idea of doing it in kind of these layers, and initially the book was going to be in several acts, and it was going to be literally an opera, which I'm still working on a script on, because I think that it's time for an Audubon opera, but nonetheless. Then the idea of the episodes was fairly obvious, because Audubon himself wrote a lot of episodes and published them, and so the structure of my episodes are sort of mirroring the structure that Audubon himself had done in his own work. And perhaps, Gregory, you want to elaborate a little bit more on his episodes that help to contextualize mine.
Sure. I have to confess, my interest in Audubon didn't stem from the operatic, but much more from the academic. I'm a college professor, a historian. My area of emphasis was from the American Revolution to the Civil War, and Audubon fits right in there. A very interesting person at a very interesting time, and I use the term interesting advisedly. But also, I happen to be a birder. And when I was casting around for something to write about, I thought, well, Audubon looks good. Audubon looks like an interesting character. I didn't know quite how interesting it was until I got into the book and started reading, as Krista alluded to, some of the episodes. Audubon would throw in these episodes every 10 chapters or so as an ornithological biography, his big book about birds, because he thought people would get bored with ornithology. So as he said, to relieve the tedium, he would put in these stories. And these are stories about the American people of various sorts, and always about Audubon himself, the most important American person I think he saw himself. Some of them are true or true enough. Others, I think, are utter fabrications, but he wrote them in order to, I will say, entertain, if not amuse or educate his audience. And some of the episodes are striking. You read them now. They can be fascinating. They can be cringe-inducing. And yet Audubon was always on display, on the show, whether he was showing his visual work, or I think, and this is something people underappreciate about Audubon, I'm glad Krista does appreciate it, he was quite a writer. A good writer, a prolific writer. And I think that at the time, in the 1830s and 40s, I think it's fair to say more people read Audubon's written work than actually saw in person his visual work. And so I think the writings are important. And I think Krista's done a good job of getting after those writings in some very fascinating ways.
Thank you. So Gregory, how did you come to write a biography about Audubon? Where did that journey begin for you? And then Krista, can you elaborate on how you got connected to Gregory and how that relationship sort of developed?
Well, I can say very simply, as I said a moment ago, I'm a historian. I was thinking about finding a new book topic. But as I said, I'm also a birder, and I thought these two things would come together. Frankly, I thought after having written several books that were about social conflict and violence and so forth, Audubon would be a little bit easier. And he wasn't. There's a lot of conflict and even some violence there too. So you just can't get away from it. Maybe that's what makes him so quintessentially American, even though he was, he adopted the nation.
Yeah, and like as I was saying, I was really drawn to photograph birds, pretty much for my own healing itself, and then it became a fascination, and I was introduced to Audubon, and again, it's his writings, his words, his story, and his journal entries that just hooked me, and I couldn't get enough of him, and I must say that as an I did I had a crush. I wanted to have been there with him. I wanted to have gone to all the places and seen all the things that he had done, and then when I began to actually do the field work and go to these places is when I became quite frustrated with him, and deep down rage started to occur, and the inner activist started to really drive the book but the project, because it took a good 10 years, and it took many trips and a lot of planning, and but it really was that real inner anger, the fire in the belly that got me to try to really understand why I wasn't seeing birds and Audubon's relationship to them. Part of that journey was to look back in time at the visual materials that were produced during this time, and I learned about the American Antiquarian Society and how they offer creative fellowships for people like myself who are artists looking to better understand the history of this country. And I received a fellowship and was able to spend several months in their archives digging through material. I was primarily interested in maps that were period maps made at the time, so that I could contextualize my work around the time of his, and the maps, which I'm fascinated in, seem to do that well. And then during the weekly lectures and speaking and meeting other historians who were there in residence with, I learned more about the economies of the time, and that they had an enormous collection of period banknotes that fully illustrate the economic aspirations of this country during Audubon's time. And they are not easy to look at. They are very descriptive. And for me, that was the key that answered the question of why I wasn't seeing the birds, and how early in the US history that the land was being converted from old growth forests, wild rivers, into agriculture, and the inclusion of enslaved people to make that economy happen, and maps that described that event in a very short period of time, 60 years, my lifetime, all during his time. And that was the real way for me to understand how quickly the US landscape changed in order to, again, bring in the Industrial Revolution and change the course of U.S. landscape. I think that those maps and the banknotes help tell that story in a way that's quite dramatic.
Absolutely. So you and Marianne have worked on a couple of book projects together in the past. Can you tell us a little bit about those projects and sort of how they've informed where you are now? Because I think they are along the same vein. But how did you know that you wanted to bring her into this particular project?
Well, let's see. Mary and I met in graduate school back in the late 80s, early 90s. We were both at Arizona State University. We were both learning in an atmosphere where landscape photography is and was very much of a central theme within the graduate program. Of course, Mark Kletz's influence on that department is and was very strong at the time. And there were a lot of people, students, who came to learn about these issues and converse about them. And so that's where Marianne and I met. And ever since then, we've been doing place-based work that is so grounded in a place, looking at the deep history of a place. And of course, she's a curator. She creates exhibitions and narratives and helps the public understand these important stories. And I, as an image maker, was wanting to go to them and then try to explain what these places not only looked like, but what went on before I got there and before European contact, and really try to decolonize my ideas and in my photographs. And Marianne was there, and so when she moved to Santa Fe, it was like, let's do it. Let's start working together. And Marianne, you take it from there, because you were working with an institution, and you were in, and it was great working with you there, doing that book.
Well, Krista and I started in 2009 working on an exhibition in a book that was called, at the New Mexico History Museum, that was called Through the Lens. It's one of the books that Krista showed you. And it was all about creating Santa Fe. And we wanted to present basically a historical and contextual perspective on the role that photography had played in both shaping and documenting this place. So at a lot of times, Through the Lens was challenging, but it was always really rewarding. And we worked really hard to include voices from Native American people, from Hispanic people, from Western Anglo-American people as authors and as photographers, so that we were looking at many different perspectives about place. And I see the arts really as a place to bring people from all walks of life together, to engage in sometimes difficult, sometimes problematic, sometimes controversial topics, but they're always really necessary conversations about the complexities of the environment. We started with Santa Fe. We're now talking about Audubon. And I would say that all of those issues are important for curators to do. And I think that, like Krista said, we've worked on a lot of projects together. She started working on Audubon in 2010, right after we worked Through the Lens. So I think in some ways there was never a time when I wasn't involved in the conversation about Audubon. And here we are now, 12 years later.
That's so wonderful. And what got you to where you are in thinking about, photography and the environment? What inspired you to be drawn to this type of work?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Shauna. In 2001, I had the great fortune to see an exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And that exhibition was called In Response to Place, Photographs from the Nature Conservancy's Last Great Places. the introduction to the accompanying publication was written by environmentalist and activist Terry Tempest Williams. And I've been reading, sort of avidly reading Terry Tempest Williams ever since I saw her speak at Changing Hands Bookstore in Tempe, Arizona, back in 1991, when she first published her book, Refuge, An Unnatural History of Family and Place. And so I've always thought that artists and writers help us to see the world in new ways and in really deep ways. So I wanted the curatorial work that I do to be part of that conversation.
Thank you for sharing. And you talk a little bit about what inspired you to be involved in Krista's project. Gregory, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think the most interesting parts of Krista's projects is, and what aspects of this work you think speak to Audubon's legacy in some new and exciting ways.
Well, I think there are a lot of things fascinating about Krista's work, and she's alluded to already the non-photographic images that she uses, the maps, the banknotes, that kind of thing. And I think it's important that those are not just a kind of visual gloss on the project. They are a central piece of what this project's all about and what the whole era was all about. The time Audubon lived in America, from basically the first half of the 19th century, was called Young America. It was a time of energy, invention, economic expansion, geographic expansion. And all of those, I think, are captured in the images that Krista provides, both the images from the 19th century, including Audubon's own, but also, yeah, the banknotes, those symbols of economic exchange, economic power, and the maps. And a lot of people look at maps and say, well, those are very pretty. They're kind of interesting. But if you look at maps, they really are documents of power, documents of possession. Because basically they say, we own this. This is our territory, whoever makes the map. And quite often you'll see, and I think you can see this in some of the maps that Krista includes, the names for European places are written in larger type fonts than the names for native places or native peoples. And just visually, those peoples are reduced in size and significance, and in some cases simply just moved off the map. And that, of course, was what was happening politically beginning in the late 1820s and on through the first half of the 19th century. It was a time of, geographic expansion on the part of white Americans, but the dispossession of native peoples and the continued possession of Black people. And so those elements, I think, are very much evident in Krista's work. She has the good sense, the good taste not to hit us over the head with that. But if you look carefully, as I think you should, it's there, and it's there in really very interesting ways. And I think that Krista has done in her book the kinds of things that perhaps artists do better than historians. And that is really to kind of create a feeling for the time, the place, some of the quirky oddities, if you will. Historians are more kind of narrative driven, and one thing happens and it happens again. But I think if you look at Krista's work, there are some ways in which the image and the information come together very creatively.
I absolutely agree with that. I wonder, can you speak a little more to like the current climate in regards to Audubon and sort of situate us in the contemporary dialogue that surrounds his legacy?
Sure. I've actually contributed to that. I wrote an essay for Audubon magazine just about exactly a year ago, in fact, pointing out the very inconvenient truth that Audubon was, among other things, a slaveholder. And the Audubon Society was aware of that. They were thinking they had to do something about that, at least to kind of admit it. And I want to be clear, the Audubon Society was not founded by John James Audubon. He died in 1851. The Audubon Society didn't start really until the 1890s and on in the first part of the 20th century. But the Audubon Society carries his name, and I think they, in some degree, carry his legacy. And I think that as Audubon tries, the society, not the person, tries to look at who it is and what it's doing, I think they've begun to realize that it's just not a bunch of white male bird watchers, that there's a whole question about habitat. Because you don't have habitat, you don't have birds. You don't have the land. And so I think that Audubon Society has become, over the past years really, a very effective advocate for environmental issues. They're not just talking about, warblers. They're talking about much bigger issues. I will say, especially since this is taking place, at least virtually, in North Carolina, there was an Audubon Society chapter in Asheville that was called the Elisha Mitchell Audubon Society. Elisha Mitchell was a 19th century scientist, geologist, meteorologist, for whom Mount Mitchell is named. But he was also, like Audubon himself, I think on the wrong side, very much on the wrong side of the slavery issue, on the wrong side of racism. And so the local chapter took his name off. They are now, I think, the Blue Ridge Audubon Society, which I think is always better to name organizations and species for places rather than people, or for something else. So I think the Audubon Society, like American society in general, is struggling. We can't forget just the impact of last summer and the ongoing conversation, to use the tamest term, about race in America. And so when we look at Audubon, the man, we have to look at Audubon as a man who was a slaveholder, who supported the institution of slavery, who opposed abolition. That's part of his legacy, along with the remarkable work in art and science that he did.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I wonder if you can talk about your own experiences in both the birding community and sort of the scholarly community surrounding Audubon. I feel like it's not uncommon, especially in academia, to find a bit of disconnect between that sort of institutional understanding and dialogue surrounding these kinds of topics and the folks who are engaging with it in a less formal perspective.
Yeah.
Is that something that you see in your experience?
Well, I think that as a historian in the scholarly community, there's been a lot of conversation throughout my whole academic career about questions of race and slavery. And particularly, of course, in my area of emphasis between the Revolution and the Civil War, this was a time of enormous contradiction, talking about liberty, but also maintaining slavery. Audubon has not been a very central figure in that. In fact, what I found in terms of most previous work I'd read on Audubon was that either the whole question of slavery got kind of ignored, or just dismissed rather quickly. Well, he was a man of his time, and let's go on to the birds again. Well, I felt I couldn't do that. I didn't want to do that. And I think that to the extent that, what people have been writing about and talking about, not just in the Audubon Society, but I think in the birding community in general. The episode with Christian and Amy Cooper last summer. I mean, that was a classic moment in what's happening in the birding community. A Black man with big binoculars in Central Park, and suddenly this woman takes him, unfortunately, for a menace. And I think it's an indication of how exceptional Black people have been portrayed, been seen in the birding community. They're becoming much more, I think, prevalent and vocal. Drew Lanham's work from Clemson University, writing about birding while Black. That's not an issue that most people in the birding community thought about or talked about until we all now have to think about it and talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Mary Ann, thinking about this sort of institutional structure, and as someone who's worked as a curator in history museums and art museums, as well as in archives and collections, can you share a little bit about your understanding of the role that these institutions play in remembering and retelling of these histories and even current events?
Thank you. Yes, I think that museums and art centers, libraries, archives, public collections, they hold art and objects and artifacts in perpetuity and trust for the public. And that word trust is really key. It's the archival documents, the records, the art that help us to interpret history through multiple lenses. And as the events of the last year have shown us again, is that we desperately need to have conversations about the records, what they are, what the art is, what the artifacts mean to different audiences, and what they show us that contextualizes our differences and our similarities. And I really think that museums should be a safe place to have important conversations. At the same time, it's really important to understand that museums have been seen as places of privilege that promote the great white voice. So what we have to do is interrogate that voice and open the door to multiple voices. It's really incumbent on museums of all kinds to establish through thoughtful exhibitions like Krista's and programming like the program we're doing now, trust and common ground. That encourages not only our audiences, but also the staff who work at the museums to have new ideas, to listen to different voices, and to be receptive to a diversity of voices. And I think one of the questions museums have to ask themselves is, how do we create stronger platforms for learning, for connections, and maybe most importantly, for empathy, for the result in taking action. And I think that these ideas were really forcefully brought to the museum world in 1992 when Fred Wilson did his seminal exhibition, Mining the Museum, where he really worked as a Black artist in the Baltimore Historical Society and recontextualized their permanent collection. And what he did was unsettle a comfortably white upper middle class narrative and draw attention to African American history and to Native American history. And I think that ever since then, museums have been trying to figure out, with more or less success, how to do that in their exhibitions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you said about like the staff and everyone who's involved in museums being an active part of that. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at with Audubon, is that he was an active participant in this conversation, good or bad, but understanding that we're all people making these things happen is really important. So let's talk about photography and biography as activism. Krista, how do you feel that your investigations into the life and legends of Audubon contribute to these current conversations about race and identity and equity?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. I appreciate it so much. My camera has taken me to a lot of places, and where I'm most interested and have been doing a lot for a long period of my time is understanding the Native perspective. And for about 7 years, when I met Dr. Dave Warren, we were doing formal government to government consultations. I was working as an arts administrator for the Western states, and we were interested in how to bring in a Native voice to our national parks. And in order to do that, we hired Dave Warren to be the consultant to conduct formal consultations, which are now called TPIC. Where again, it's you're working with federal agencies and tribes in order to understand where the common ground is, so that our national parks could be more balanced in interpretation. And working in those consultations was a form what really interests me, and it has kept me in touch with policy that goes on amongst the tribal nations, and understanding how their sovereignty is a critical part of how land use management should and is being cared for in this country. And so my trail of making photographs has led me down several rabbit holes, which have eventually gotten me to the conclusion that in order to bring these birds back, in order to have healthy bird populations, we need to restore and restory our river systems and wetlands and forests. And I'm most particularly interested in those where Audubon went, the landscapes that he wrote about, and it's quite a bit. And when you think about the river system, it includes the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and then the Missouri River. And it's all in the heartland of America. And all of that needs to have an opportunity to look at how it can be rewilded, recovered, and with that large swath of along the margins of these rivers, how tribal laws and tribal nations can engage in this very important work. And so for me, the activism is at the edge of tribal laws and US laws. And I'm not a lawyer, but I'm an artist, and I can think about these interdisciplinary things and at least initiate conversations so that we can integrate. Where are the similarities, and how can we work in partnership? And since the house is on fire, it's time to really begin to look at new ways to cool it down and make it healthy for more birds to arrive. And that requires new partnerships that are real, based in treaty obligations, sovereign rights, and laws that govern this country.
Absolutely, thank you. We have a couple of questions from our audience. The first one is from Roger Atkins, who wants to know, Krista, was there any place that you saw that would appear to have remained unchanged since Audubon's time?
No, I mean, there are pockets of wetland and forests that are like pearls along on a necklace, that they're little pockets that move along different riverways, but it's what's in between those pockets that are filled with roads and commercial buildings, and so the birds have to go from one pocket to the next in hopes to arrive where they are migrating. And whereas the trees in a certain area may be old and intact, it's really a small area, and it doesn't therefore sustain what is necessary in order to have healthy avian populations. And that's what we need to connect. We've got to create more connectivity, more biodiversity along these long waterways, so that it's an easier way for these species to move in and out, because that's what they need. And a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, that is really powerful. Thank you. And from David Nobles to Dr. Nobles, do you know how or why Audubon became interested in birds?
It's easier to say when. He did as a young boy. He was just a bit of very quick moment of biography. He was born in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. His father took him out when he was a toddler, sent him to France, where he lived. And he grew up in France until he was age 18, and then he comes to the United States, ostensibly to manage his father's farm in Pennsylvania, also to dodge the draft from Napoleon. But he started drawing birds when he was a boy, and his father wanted him to become something more useful, an engineer, a naval officer, whatever. And you can imagine a conversation in which a young boy says to his father, I want to has been my career being a bird artist. This was not a lucrative opportunity at the time. And Audubon tried a bunch of other things. He had other, I wouldn't call them careers, but certainly professions, jobs. But he had this passion for drawing birds that started, I would say, certainly in his early teenage years. And then, of course, it stayed with it. I mean, he was obsessive about birds, about collecting and depicting birds. And so it was a lifetime passion of his. Krista talked earlier about her early engagement with a camera. And I think Audubon's was early engagement with drawing birds. And some of his early drawings are fascinating, and they're really, really quite good. They're not to the level of what his great work, as he called it, The Birds of America. But you can tell even as a child living in France, he did some remarkably, I think, very good drawings.
Thank you. And this next question was kind of collaboratively crafted between Marianne and I for Krista. Throughout history, birds have been really symbolic of the connection between heaven and earth, beyond this life and the life beyond, carrying messages and prayers and blessings between the humans and the God. And certainly John James Audubon's artwork still captures the public imagination, even though some of the birds that he drew are extinct and many are endangered. You talk so much about not finding the birds that you'd hope to see as you retrace this journey. And your previous work really extensively examines those birds and their habitats as those conduits for larger conversations. And I know you touched on this a bit, but I wonder if you can elaborate on your own connection to birds and what keeps you going to be connected to them and how what they represent in your own work.
Yeah. So yeah, the birds, I met them more, or became more interested in them, boy, when I was about 45. And before then, I saw them in the sky, but it just didn't connect with me at all. And yet it was really my own health, my challenges with my own health, that made that connection. And I stick with that because as I struggle with keeping my health in good shape, which thank goodness it is right now, it right away is the connection broader to birds. And I keep saying it over and over, it's just making that habitat healthy, diverse, so that they and all other, creatures can have a healthier life. And it does come back to just basic health and maintaining that health so that we can attempt to live our lives as older people that we all aspire to. And so birds, I have not really spent time trying to figure out exactly how many feathers they have or what the beak is. And I'm not an ornithologist, but I dearly love ornithologists and bird watchers. And yet somewhere as I try to identify and hear, it becomes a little too much information for me. And I tend to stick more in the metaphor and working on the habitat. And so go for it, birders, and keep me posted.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And really sweetly, as you were talking, a little bird came and perched on my window beside me. So how do you sustain your dedication to a project? What is it like for you to work for so many years with the same subject matter? And this kind of ties into an audience question we have from Cornwagon Thunder, who wants to know if you can talk about some of the wrong turns that you might have made on your journey and what surprising places that those may have led you to.
Wow. Well, wrong turns is a good way to say it. I would call them rabbit holes. And I know that everyone who has spent any time with me as my dear friends or colleagues, they have observed me trailing down rabbit holes in search of some idea that seems to be critical at the moment. And that's why the project took such a long time, because there were just so many questions that or trails that led me into areas that took time. And I'll go back to getting lost is the beginning of discovery. And I'm going to kind of stick with that topic, because I think for artists or myself, I need to get lost in a subject, deeply involved, deeply lost, deeply unsure of myself. And that is one of the things that I really appreciate about John James Audubon, is his self-doubt. He was filled with it, and he wrote about it tenderly in his journals. And he didn't feel like he was good enough, and that he was just, again, filled with that not knowing and self-doubt. And yet he also had the side of being persistent and uncompromising, and was bound to finish this project. And I'm going back to the self-doubt part, which helps in going down, in getting lost in your subject, and then finding your way out of it to discover what it is that you really were looking for, that you had no idea was actually there. And I just want to respect that process in myself, and I saw it in Audubon over and over, and that's where we actually connected quite well with each other.
Yeah, thank you. And, while there is sort of a solemnness and this feeling of solitude in a lot of the environments you photograph, and maybe perhaps in some of your process of going down those rabbit holes, you do have a really rich focus on community and connecting with the folks who are a part of these environments and who are a part of this story. You even sought out permission from a Standing Rock Sioux Tribal Authority before you would exhibit some of the images that you made. Can you speak to that facet of your work and why it's so important for you to make those connections? And we also have a question from the comment that ties in, or from the chat that ties in really well here, from Dawn Star Crowther, who says that you mentioned your early awareness and experience with Indigenous peoples in your family. And can you expand on how that has been present in your work and this body of work in particular?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I grew up around Indigenous people. I am not Native American, but I was cared deeply by Native peoples, and it was my comfort zone early as a child. So throughout my career and life, I have gone back to that comfort zone of connecting to Indigenous people where I live and where I work. And it's a way just for me to stay healthy. And so when I read Audubon, I was initially very interested in his interaction with Native peoples and in his writings. And it happens over and over in all of his journals and episodes, most of them. And it really came to bear when I followed him on his 1843 journey up the Missouri River. And there, in his journals, I was particularly interested in going to places where he had an interaction with different people, tribes, and I wanted to see what they look like now. And so journeying up around Standing Rock, I knew from his journals that he had twice commented about these interesting stone formations that he had seen. And they're called cannonball concretions. And I, of course, got very interested in seeing, well, what is that? And how could I, what does it look like? I wanted to at least try to find them. And this was in 2015, before the encampment at Standing Rock took place, and it was Audubon who uh, got me there, and I found several of them in a public park in Mobridge, um, South Dakota, excuse me. And I right away knew that these were incredibly special. And I knew that they were a central part of my journey with Audubon. And I knew that in order for me to publish them or even talk about them, I would need to connect with the tribal authority to see if it was okay. And I have learned that over the course of years, in order to just be careful, ask if you want to build trust in a long-term relationship. And so I made the images, and I went to Indian Market here in Santa Fe, where many tribes and people, artists come every year to sell their wares. And I was able to immediately find some artists from Lakota area, and I showed them the photographs, and they immediately knew of their value and importance. And they immediately introduced me to John Eagle, who is with the Standing Rock Sioux Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And I knew that I wanted to connect with him and show him the photographs and see if they were able to be exhibited. And over the course of several months in conversations, he agreed to come and do the opening prayer at my exhibition at Northlight Gallery at Arizona State University. And of course, anytime I photographed and received help from finding a place by a Native person, I would always send photographs back to show them what I was doing. And it's about building trust and keeping the connection. And it's the only way that I work at this point, because it's the only way that really matters at this point. And so yeah, that's part of it, and that's why it takes a time, and it also respects the place-based materials that are sacred. And I'm a visitor in their community, and I just want to act appropriately.
Thank you. We have a question from Karen Ebenheiser Harris, who says that Krista, you seem to be focusing on a sort of loss of habitat, species, a historical past, and often using the medium of film, which is arguably endangered by the prevalence of digital imaging. She says, I heard you describing the joy of the darkroom, but was wondering if you could speak more to that choice of utilizing film in the silver gelatin prints and why you choose to do that.
Well, I think I'm a dog that keeps onto the same trick. And I felt so comfortable for years being in the darkroom. And I just loved it. And I had a hard time adjusting to digital. And it never caught my passion in the same way as film. And so I decided, okay, let's just stick with it. And fortunately, there are enough people out there in the world who are using film, and it's fairly easy to find. You have to be thoughtful, and you have to store it in your freezer, and you have to prepare in advance. And when you're going out into the field, and then you need a refrigerator in order to keep the film in good shape when you're in a hot place. And it's a lifestyle. And once you're used to it, I just, again, don't see it making a change, albeit obviously I'm here working in Zoom, and I've published a book, and in order to get that film into a book form, you have to go through the process of digital scanning and preparing those files. And were it just that part of it, I don't think I would be continuing. Well, it would be a different body of work. But for me, being in a place, finding it, using that film, and not knowing what I'm going to get, and just having the sheer faith that it's all going to work out, intrigues me, and it keeps me curious. If I knew what it was going to be, why would I do it?
Krista, I'm going to jump in and ask a question that follows on Karen's. Will you talk a little bit about your camera? Because I think that's also a part of this question, and your answer I think would be really interesting.
Oh, well, thank you. There are several different cameras in this book. One is a Diana, and this is a plastic camera with a plastic lens. There is no there's no light meter in it. It is so manual and basic. And you have to tape it even, because there are lights that come into the camera because it's plastic. It's perfect metaphor for how whatever tool you use, it's okay. And so Diana, and the picture's fuzzy, and it just works. So then, of course, I use a Hasselblad, which is got a beautiful sharp lens, and it really is juicy working with that material. Now, Hasselblad is a studio camera. I brought it out into the field, and it's kind of delicate. It needed a lot of care. It's not perfect for being out there, but it worked well for me. And I'm currently working with a Linhof, which is more of a panoramic camera. It was built in Germany in the 1930s. It's totally manual. It is, there's no, again, light meter. There's nothing electronic in it. And I just find these tools, these cameras, to have such personality that they definitely drive my curiosity and the work that I produce.
Thank you so much. And your process ties really nicely into a question that I'd love to close with. I know we have just a couple of minutes left, but Marianne, in some of your writings about place, you make this really powerful assertion that living in a place and being with a place, there's this sense of responsibility to wherever it is that you are. And I wonder if you could expand on that, and whether or not you find elements of that sort of relational philosophy embedded in this project, and how you sort of see the idea or the role of the photographer playing into this idea of responsible placemaking. And Krista, please share about your own philosophy and practice as a photographer who is obviously so deeply connected to the ecology of the place that you live with.
That's a great question to end on. And I think Krista talks about this a little bit, but also if you read the conversation that Joanna Hurley and I have with Krista at the end of her book, everything that Krista does is place-based. She has a commitment to place. Maybe that comes from traveling so much as a young person, wanting to dive into place. And certainly for Audubon, he was in search of the birds, but he desperately wanted to understand where he was. And part of that was exploring the landscape. And in Krista's book, in the same way, most of the photographs are of place. They are of landscape. They are of showing the beauty of that place, whether it's pristine or it's more chaotic in some ways. And so I think that Audubon had this commitment to place. Krista has this commitment to place. One thing that's really interesting about Krista is that she went to Hampshire College, where Jerome Liebeling taught, and Ken Burns also went there a few years before Krista. So there's this tie back to the Photo League and photographers using creative photography to investigate social responsibility. That's also very much based in place. And then there's a direct line from that, from the Photo League to the FSA photographers, Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, Walker Evans, and let us now praise famous men. So all of that is part of Krista's training. It's part of my training in photo history. And I think that when you tell stories, when they're place-based, people are very invested in those stories. And so Krista talks about bringing the birds back. And so if we all collectively shape place, and therefore we have a responsibility to place. to history, to time. And we have to see the interrelationships of all of those clearly. We have to not shy away from what's difficult in history or place. If we don't like it, if we don't agree with it, we have a responsibility to listen. And I think that's what artists and writers help us do. They help us to see, they help us to hear, they help us to listen with our hearts. And that couldn't happen without an investment in place.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I would just encourage everyone to go see the exhibition at the Turchin Center. And the book is itself on a boat coming from Singapore to the Los Angeles harbor and is currently not right available at this moment in time. However, thanks to the COVID and all the delays, it will arrive, and I'd encourage you to go to your favorite bookstore and purchase it or pick it up there. And I think it'll be available in September. And thank you so much for your interest in my work, and look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. And as a reminder to everyone who's joining us today, you can see the walkthrough video of the gallery anytime on our YouTube page, which is accessible through our website. And Christy will put a link to the exhibition page in the chat for you as well, which will have additional images and videos and resources about this work if you'd like to take a deeper dive after hearing such great information about it during today's Lunch and Learn. We'll also send a recording of this talk to everyone who registered, so please feel free to share that with folks who you think might be interested. And be sure to check out the Turchin Center's website for more information about planning a visit to our galleries, as we're now back to our regular hours. You can also subscribe to our mailing list to get updates about exhibitions and any upcoming events that we have. Christy will drop links to those web pages in the chat for you as well. Thank you so much, Krista and Mary Ann and Gregory, for so graciously sharing your time and your work and insights with us today. And thank you for everyone who joined us, for sharing space with us on this digital platform. It's really nice to celebrate our exhibiting artists and connect around their work and continue to cultivate community in these really new and exciting